Hello and welcome to the Matt's Movie Reviews podcast. I am your host, Matthew Pejkovic, and this is episode number 659. Releasing February 16 on Shudder is The Last Sacrifice, a documentary that delves into the unsolved 1945 Valentine's Day murder of Charles Walton, an event that will go on to inspire the 1973 movie The Wicker Man and give birth to the folk horror genre. A documentary that connects the thread between folklore, true crime, and horror filmmaking. The Last Sacrifice also digs into the dark history of witchcraft in Britain and how the horrors of the past can still haunt the present. And joining me today to talk about The Last Sacrifice is the film's director, Mr. Rupert Russell. Rupert, I thank you so very much for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So the first question I got to ask, and I don't mean any way to be, take any offense from it or anything like that at all. But is it true that, and I found this in my research, you didn't watch The Wicker Man until 2022? Is this correct?
I'm haunted by this. I know it's sort of like this. I'm being persecuted by the Wicker Man Uber fandom for not have been a born again, or at least an original lover of the film. Yes, that is true. I actually didn't. Well, the Wicker Man was on. Like we all have those lists of classic films to watch, and I was
Yeah.
absurdly late with getting to it, as there are other films on my list that I still haven't got around to watching, sadly. But I saw it in 2022. Was it then? Is that what I said? I think that makes sense. Or 23. Um, it was 23 actually. And I saw it and I just thought it was a film about Britain today.
Hmm.
That was my immediate response was like, this isn't a film about the 70s or this is a film about today. And it was really that famous speech that Howie gives um uh on the rock face or on the cliffs at the end, Joey says, "No, don't you think that killing me isn't going to bring back your apples? Don't you know killing me isn't going to bring back your apples?" And I was like, that is just me shouting at the television of British news of just this complete nonsense that was just dribbling out of our politicians' mouths about all kinds of things, all these fake promises, all these fantasies, all these ideas that if only Britain. So literally Boris Johnson's idea was that we were going to go to all the colonies who fought violent revolutions to get rid of us in a
Hmm.
massive ship with a flag on it. And they were going to give us all these amazing things. I mean, it was sort of Wicker Man level delusion. And this had been going on for years. And so I sort of felt that The Wicker Man was a really great way to look at British society and the particular um, lies and myths we tell about ourselves and the delusions that we hold.
Now, did you watch this in preparation for working on The Last Sacrifice, or did this happen beforehand and this kind of ushered in The Last Sacrifice as a project for you afterwards?
The second one, so as I said, I had this response to it, and I called a very close friend of mine. He's in the film, Tim Stanley. He writes for Telegraph. Knows a lot about politics, obviously. He writes about it for a job. And he's also a massive 70s horror nut. And he said, well, there was this real murder that happened in 1945 that inspired the whole thing. And of course, being a documentary person, we're always on the lookout for a good true crime caper. It's our
Yeah.
kind of bread and butter in the industry. And so I started looking into it, and it was from there that I got the idea of, well, it was there I got interested in the case, but I think, the immediate problem with the case is, from a filmmaking standpoint, is everyone's dead. There is zero archive of the time. I mean, great story, but there's nothing kind of surviving from 1945 beyond the police report and what was contained in that in the National Archives. Um, but I also saw this as an opportunity because I also discovered that, it wasn't just the Wicker Man that the murder of Charles Walton influenced, it was the whole genre. And I thought, oh, that could be interesting. You could really take all of these films that the murder influenced, and you could tell the story that way, and that could be creatively much more interesting than a bunch of old black and white photographs.
I find it interesting sometimes how some a grisly event in history can just propel so many pieces of art, especially films. Ed Gein, for example,
Yeah.
the stuff that he did um, gave birth to Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Silence of the Lambs and Psycho and all this other stuff. And hearing the Charles Walton murder it gives birth to a lot of stuff that we see with folk horrors from all the way back when with Wicker Man to now as well. But when you first kind of dive into the case and the themes around it, what's the kind of first thing you kind of look into? Are you looking into the movies that are inspired by the case, or are you looking at the case and how it kind of inspires everything else? Because it's such a chicken and egg kind of thing going on here, Because on one hand, there's a supposed witchcraft killing that could have been based on things from the past, but then this thing from that time affects things in the future. It's like a secular kind of thing that's going around here.
I think just in terms of process, the first thing to get my grips with was just the case.
Hmm.
It's just the nuts and bolts of what happened, who did what, who are the suspects, what are the theories. And so I just started reading the books, some of which, like The Case That Foiled Fabian, are very thorough, but I felt he was a bit too tied to Fabian's police report. And then there were other um, books like Murder by Witchcraft that are probably just completely made up. And so it was a case of, reading these different sources, looking at the police report file, looking at the um, original police report that, the chief inspector Robert Fabian wrote, then looking at his memoirs. He then changes his mind over his life. He actually writes three memoirs and revisits the case in two of them and actually changes his account. And so at first the thing is just, get to grips with the story, what are the different theories? And then I then think that the next step was then looking at the witchcraft and occult revival in the 60s and 70s and sort of seeing these as the two sort of main sources of cultural inspiration that were feeding into the films. I think that was, and feeding into culture, because that's of course what's interesting. I think with all of these things, whether it's Ed Gaines or in the UK, we have a very similar case in the UK, the murder of Meghan McCann. It's
Hmm.
kind of, or sorry, I shouldn't say murder, I should say disappearance of Meghan McCann, who is this unsolved mystery that just rumbles for years in the tabloids. And for whatever reason, sometimes these cases just, you know, they just strike a chord with the public imagination. And that's interesting in of its own right. And I think that's sort of what I was trying to pick out was it was not just what happened to Charles Walton, but what was it about this murder that was really ignited the British psyche, not just in the 40s when it happened, but in the 50s, the 60s, and actually the early 70s as well. It was still massively discussed in the tabloid press. There were books being written about it. What was it about this murder of the 74-year-old farm laborer that kind of grip the nation? What does it say about us? What does it say about the kind of country that we're being? At the same time, there was a genuine witchcraft revival going on in the country, and there were absolutely fabulous kind of Mondo style documentaries that were made at the time. And I kind of realized that I could pivot between the fiction world of folk horror and then the kind of documentary world of these, of which there were loads of these sort of really fantastic shot on, 35mm film of kind of witches running around naked in Notting Hill. And actually they were more out there than the horror movies. And that's always more fun, is when real life is more exciting than when fact is more exciting than fiction. That's, again, documentary, that's where we want to be. We want to be in those cases that are actually kind of um we're sort of where real life is beating out fantasy life. And I think in late 60s Britain, that was just definitely the case, and the archive still survived. And so that was kind of the genesis of the case, putting together these, or the film was rather putting together these kind of jigsaw puzzles.
The Matt's Movie Reviews podcast is brought to you by Amazon Prime Video. One of the best on-demand streaming services available, Amazon Prime Video features exclusive Amazon originals as well as popular movies and TV shows. Watch Amazon Prime Video anytime, anywhere. Speaking of jigsaw puzzles, I absolutely love the editing that Alexander McNeil does in this movie. You got like these you mentioned before, kind of like these the Mondo documentaries. Some of them BBC documentaries, like Legend of the Witch and such, like taxpayer funded stuff, which is quite funny when you think about it now. In those documentaries, but then you blend in kind of like horror clips and other things as well. Um, and it kind of makes this really kind of great kind of like puzzle piece of like all these things that come together. And again, it's that secular thing that all these things kind of connect to one another. You're almost using the clips to kind of tell the story of what's going on. Because of course, 1945, you don't have access to things back then. No one had archive stuff. Where did the idea come from to use those kind of clips to kind of tell your story? And how hard was it to try to get copyright for some of this stuff? Because I talk to documentary filmmakers quite a bit, and a lot of times some of the biggest kind of pain in the ass when it comes to putting together a documentary where you kind of rely on kind of clips like this is sometimes a whole copyright issue in regards to some of these movies.
Well, on the creative, I always knew, as I mentioned at the beginning, that I wanted to tell the story through the horror films and the documentaries. And I was, from just the first stuff I was putting together, then you could pivot off fact and fiction, could be really interesting. Like, where does mythology come from? It's never completely from nowhere, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't be interesting. I think mythology, if it's going to really have longevity in the culture, really has to strike a chord with something real. And so sort of looking at fact and fiction through these two different sources, documentary archive and horror films, like I knew on from the beginning, however, I knew I wanted an approach that wasn't going to be like every other true crime documentary, which sort of, you go on Netflix and it's always like, this drone shot going down a suburban street in
Oh
America
yeah.
for 20 seconds. And it's just become, the first 400 times it was fine. And now, like, I just never want to see that again on a personal level. And I thought, wouldn't it? What would be a different way to approach this? And I thought, why not work with a trailer editor? Because what people do in trailers is they actually that idea in turn came from Oliver Stone, who got a commercial editor to cut JFK.
Right.
And if you kind of watch JFK, it is um, incredibly choppy. It's got this kind of amazing energy to it. And sorry, got this sort of amazing energy to it. And I thought, wouldn't it be fun to kind of harness that for this? And so I went to Intermission Film, who, the top trailer house in London, and I started through that working with Alexander Manil, who's obviously a fantastic trailer editor. And that was his first documentary feature that he cut. And in terms of the archive, it was just a mixture of licensing
Mm.
and fair use.
When you are choosing what clips to use, especially from say like 60s horror movies, 70s horror movies, folklore movies, are there titles that you came across which you became a big fan of? Was there films that you saw maybe in your research you're like, I haven't seen this before, but now this is kind of like something I gotta have this maybe in a physical copy in my library somewhere.
Yeah, loads, loads. I think the two that kind of I really loved were they were great premises for a film. One is Twins of Evil,
Hmm.
the Hammer one, which is if your people aren't familiar with it, it's a great premise. It's some kind of indeterminate period in history, which I love Hammer does. They just are like in the olden times. It's never quite clear when it is because it's whatever they had in the costume department and like whatever
That's right.
sets they had lying around to threw together. But it's some ye olde Germany or Austria. And Peter Cushing has these two hot blonde twin nieces who are actually real
Of
Playboy
course.
models, Swedish
Of course.
Playboy models, Playgirl models, if it is, from the 70s. And actually they couldn't speak English. They actually realized it's until later. They're actually dubbed throughout the entire film. Their English apparently was terrible. So they actually were dubbed. And so, Peter Cushing is like the local witch catcher. He's kind of middle class. Class is super important in Hammer film. It's always foregrounded, actually, in the storytelling. So he's this kind of, middle class local witch catcher, and him and his friends for fun in their kind of puritanical piousness. Every evening go out and burn a local witch. That's their kind of jam. And anyway, he gets these two nieces that are coming to stay with him, and he's sort of in this existential battle with this count who lives on a castle who's into kind of black magic, voodoo, that kind of all the fun stuff, orgies, a kind of Marquis de Sade meets Lord Summerisle character. And it's a sort of depraved aristocrat in every sense of the word. And he has these two twins, and one of the twins loves Jesus, and the other twins wants to run off with the evil count. And then Peter Cushing's character, because they're identical twins, cannot figure out which one to burn at the stake. And I just think that is the best premise for any horror film ever. So that was a lot of fun. And then Demons of the Mind is totally batshit. It makes basically no sense until about halfway through the film. It's about this, like, again, it's a Lord of a Manor film. He has a castle, and he's got these two teenage kids, probably 18 years old, and he's locking them in separate rooms. And the first 45 minutes, you have no idea what is going on. And it's then revealed that he himself believes himself to be a part of a cursed bloodline of incest and vampirism or werewolfism or murder. And he sort of believes that his two children, if he lets them out of their rooms, are going to immediately commit incest and murder. And I won't spoil what actually happens, but it's a pretty out there film. And I think Hammer kind of made it and then was scared of the premise of it. And that's why the film doesn't make much sense. I actually was also told by Jonathan Rigby that it was originally a werewolf film, so I don't quite know what the story of the film is, but it's very bizarre, but it's totally out there and mad, and I would definitely encourage people to check both of them out.
The Matt's Movie Reviews YouTube channel is brought to you by TeePublic. TeePublic is the world's largest marketplace for independent creators to sell their work on the highest quality merchandise. With over 1.2 million designs, TeePublic is sure to have something you'll love. Um, you mentioned before about Bob Fabian, who was kind of like known then as England's greatest detective, kind of like, his detective skills like compared to Sherlock Holmes and such. He caught jewel thieves and everything else, but he couldn't solve this case, right? And no one has been able to since then. I find it kind of interesting. So a couple of weeks ago, I was listening to this podcast. I like true crime stuff, and there was this cold case investigator who was used AI to help kind of like decipher this undecipherable kind of zodiac kind of letter. And from that, he came down to he thinks he knows who the zodiac is using modern day technologies and his own kind of instincts put back together. Do you think there could be a chance in the future that maybe the use of modern day technologies, um, artificial intelligence, etc., in like modern day kind of sleuths and such, could be able to crack the Charles Walton case as well? Or do you think that this is the kind of case that so many years have gone by, so many decades? I mean, we're near like like almost 20 years off from like a century of it coming off. That this one is never going to be solved. And besides, the theories as to what it could be are more fun than finding the real life killer anyway.
Yeah, I think that there's just not enough data out there. It's just so thin. I mean, the reports were, I mean, thin in the sense that they interviewed a lot of people. The report is quite thorough, in that sense, but I just feel like people weren't honest.
Hmm.
And I think people were holding back. I think for that reason, the data's impoverished, and so I'm not really sure not even the best analysis can kind of do much about it. I mean, we know Alfred Potter was lying. For example, you read the transcripts, that's totally obvious that him and his wife are lying about everything. And he was the chief suspect in the case, so he probably most likely was the guy that did it. But we don't know his motivations. I think that's the part of it that is the most uh and of course there were different theories, his he had a dead heifer the day before. Did he have money problems of his own? Who knows? And we go into different theories in the film. But I also think that there are these cases that actually it's like with the Zodiac Killer, like what's in the reason why the Zodiac Killer is still talked about is that we don't know who it was, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
sure.
that's part of the appeal. I think that's also true with sort of the murder of Charles Walton, is I think a lot of these cases kind of I think the reason why they are so resonant is they invite the viewer or the reader into the world and then you project your own stuff, right? You're kind of invited to kind of put the pieces together, but inevitably you do that in a way that conforms to your own biases. And I think that's sort of what's fun about the Charles Walton murder in particular is it's a bit of a Rorschach test, for what do you think about, especially British people. I mean, the film plays slightly differently in different territories, as you can imagine, but I think British people definitely see the film as a film about Britain. and what it
Mm.
says about British identity. That's kind of where it sort of lands with the audiences, whereas I think Americans tend to see it as a kind of much more kind of occult true crime caper. And of course, the film is both of those things, but it is a kind of Rorschach test of kind of you're all looking at the same images, but what you bring to it, what you see out of it, I think is sort of really revealing, and I think that's actually one of the most fun parts um about making films like this that are in some senses open-ended, is that it really gives the audience room to kind of be creative themselves and kind of come up with their own ideas.
Well, for myself, I see the movie as kind of like the origin of a subgenre of horror more than anything else. And I guess that comes from just who I am as a person as well. I'm a big horror film fan and such, and that's something that kind of really fascinates me about this movie. Sometimes the inspirations of some of my favorite films come from the most ghastly of places. Dealing with real life people, and there can be a tinge of guilt that comes from that as well. But at the same time, there's such great rewards that have come from it, which is a weird thing to actually kind of say. I mean, you call it the last sacrifice, after sacrifice kind of comes kind of like, an abundance of kind of like, maybe reward for it. In which is it's a kind of weird to talk about when you talk about a real life person, but it's something that happens with sometimes with some of these movies. They're based on real grisly things, but from it come really great movies, and I think that's a fascinating kind of subject for the film. This film delves into as well, I think.
Well, it's what grips you, right? And I think when things are taboo breaking, they are in like an anthropological sense, things that we pay attention to, right? It's like, why is Freud so powerful still? Like, why this guy is because he, Oedipus complex is about taboo, right? It's about, it's the story of Oedipus, right? Why does that Greek myth endure for thousands of years about a guy who kills his father and marries his mother? It's like that still strikes a chord, right? As being something kind of demented. And I think, you look at like Greek mythology, it's all totally demented. It's all incest and murder, but that's kind of it's all like the most taboo breaking and weird things are the things that kind of strike a chord with our culture. Things that are kind of prosaic and mundane sort of fade away into the background. And so I think culture is usually I'm not surprised that culture is usually defined by things that are sort of at the extremes. Even somebody as kind of mainstream as kind of Steven Spielberg, you think about what is he known for, sharks and aliens.
Yes.
Both things that are on the extremes of uh human experience. I mean, he, treats them in a very kind of family friendly, although not unapologetic, I think in a brutal way as well. But he's definitely not a Hammer. I wouldn't want to be a Hammer, Hammer horror filmmaker. But even somebody as mainstream as him, the same as with James Cameron, even these guys who are as mainstream as they are, they're always drawing from the edges and bringing it to the center, whether it's from aliens, conspiracy, the occult. Spielberg obviously did Poltergeist as well. He's done quite a lot of things like that, and he produced it. And I just think it's at the edges, which is what grips it, and it's no surprise that filmmakers or writers or storytellers were always kind of reaching out from that, although the end result ends up being something quite different.
Yeah.
So, The Wicker Man itself is a very different film to sort of, avoid a very different situation to, the murder of Charles Walton. But that's also, I think, what makes it interesting because it's not a facsimile, but it's a translation. And in that translation process, they were bringing in the hippie movement, the counterculture, the revival of, paganism that was sort of happening in the 60s, but also other contemporary things like class war. I mean, this was a bigger piece in earlier edits we had of the film, but Hammer films are all about class war, right? They're always about an aristocrat. Sorry, the archetype of the film often is, middle class outsider from the new professional classes in Britain. So that could be a teacher, could be a doctor, could be a policeman, goes to a small rural village where the peasantry is in kind of cahoots with the aristocrat, or rather, the peasantry is under the spell of the aristocrat, and they are kind of in this unholy alliance against the kind of new professional middle class that was kind of growing in Britain after sort of World War II. And so that's a kind of another cultural element that the writers and the storytellers are kind of bringing in. And I think that's sort of where this all gets really fascinating, is in this kind of translation process where the filmmakers, the writers are pulling from all kinds of different stories, and in doing so can tell us so much about the time, but they also tell us, I think, a lot about today as well, because if they didn't, these films wouldn't still be, rewatched, worshipped, and adored the way they are now.
So for everyone out there listening, February 16, The Last Sacrifice on Shudder. I highly recommend people check out this film. I watched it the first time maybe a couple years ago, I think, maybe a year and a half ago. Watched it again recently. It's interesting watching the second time. You kind of pick up on things that you didn't think about the first time over, which is my favorite type of documentary. And Rupert Russell, you did a really great job here. Congratulations to you. And I can't wait to see what you do in the future. Hopefully we can talk again. It's been a pleasure.
Definitely. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for watching the Matt's Movie Reviews channel. Please subscribe for more reviews, podcast interviews, and exclusive content.